Okay, thank you, Betty. So I want to begin with this first slide here to just call out that this part of the webinar presents the system level analysis approach and some elements of the larger comprehensive success factor analysis process from which it's derived. And both of these were developed by Professor Joe Sinfield and his team at Purdue University. And so SLA is an adaptation derived from a much more extensive process known as comprehensive success factor analysis. And it allows us to examine existing challenges through the lens of what are called success factors in order to define a problem, identify research questions, and think about potential solutions. SLA utilizes some of the core components of the CSFA process, and its overall goal is to get research teams to think more broadly about what it takes for their work to achieve its greatest impact. Now, CSFA approach is a much larger, more extensive, and much more time-consuming process. So Joe Sinfield has distilled down SLA from this larger process in order for it to be applied by research teams on a shorter time frame to pinpoint problems and come up with research questions for a particular project. Now, on the slide, there are a couple resources shown here. One is a link to the video that describes the process, and we've derived information from that video and kind of distilled it here as kind of a walking guide or a walkthrough, a guide to use as you apply SLA to your project if you choose to do so. The other is a journal article that describes the CSFA process in much more detail. And actually, we've extracted a portion of that article and summarized it, and that's part of the RFA. It's the appendix of the RFA that covers CSF in more detail. Okay, next slide. And I apologize, I'm going to be talking quickly because I have a lot to get through here. So on this slide here, this just is showing that the purpose of this overview is to provide RFA applicants with an introduction to this method so they can complete the required systems level component of the RFA using this approach. And the guiding question here is, how can teams utilize this SLA process to identify research questions to define their project? So Betty covered the RFA requirements. I've taken these directly from the RFA, and the bullet points here, the key takeaway is that you will need to use some type of system level analytical framework for identifying 2 to 4 opportunities for research that are tied to the country priority needs as outlined by USAID. This is bullet 2 on the slide. From these identified opportunities, you will then choose one that will be the focal point of your research proposal. That's bullet 3. While you have several methodological options to select from, LASER encourages you to use SLA. And regardless of what method you use, you must demonstrate your work. And this is bullet number 4. So again, we are covering SLA because that's the method that LASER uses and promotes. So we'll now cover systems level thinking and describe what success factors are. So why system level thinking? Next slide, please. Many development problems have persisted throughout time because of their inherent complexity. It reflects interrelated contextual factors all across different geographies and socioeconomic influences. It is very rare today that development challenges can be tackled with simple, straightforward solutions, and therefore complex problems need to be examined considering the wider system within which they reside. And work leading up to SLA has uncovered 15 general categories of success factors that are common across all development sectors. And this is where we begin. Next slide. So think about a puzzle. You have an idea of what it is supposed to look like, and your job is to find the missing pieces to complete it. A comprehensive list of all factors that need to be in place to to achieve desired outcomes would describe an ideal system state in which all required elements are functioning. That would be the full picture of the puzzle. But in this case, we use the 15 categories of broad success factors to help us identify the key missing puzzle pieces. Research gap identification requires that we examine the differences between the desired ideal state of the system being studied and the current state of the system. Next slide. So here are the 15 categories of success factors. An examination of success factors and their relevance to the problem will help to identify gaps for further research. Specifically, we're looking at whether these factors have not been addressed or need more attention, and we have a template to help guide us through the process, and that's what the purpose of this presentation is to go through that template in some detail. Again, it is crucial to understand that we are looking for success factors that are missing from the system being examined. So in this success factor, these 15 success factors, they're kind of color-coded into 4 broad categories. You have kind of the green and yellow, which is like infrastructure and capital, and you have the blue, which is kind of more people-centric motivation, strategies for adapting. Then you have the purple, which is kind of measurement and evaluation, sustainability, resilience. Then you have the orange area, which is government policy, security, that kind of thing. So this success factor tree, we think of the broad categories as the roots of the tree, and in this broad category, we view that as the lens that you can look at the problem through, and they serve as a guide to structure the problem and help identify the key missing success factors. So each of the 15 categories will have one or more subcategories or branches that describe the various success factors in more detail. And therefore, a fully formed success factor tree represents a complete list of success factors that could be required for the system to function. Note that some success factors are already present in the context of a specific problem and thus operate at desired levels of effectiveness already, and so we don't necessarily worry about them. We are looking for those success factors that are not adequately addressed already, and may not have adequate evidence to determine the best solutions. And so these are the factors that are likely to merit the most attention and must be identified to help us with our research problem or research question. Okay, next slide. So this slide shows a success factor in a little bit more detail. So we're looking at the branches now. So we're looking at the infrastructure category, which is in yellow. And we're looking at infrastructure development and maintenance in more particular detail. And so there's several sub branches here. Physical infrastructure that needs to be met, like basic needs, education and training needs, healthcare needs, R&D. We're also looking at resources for infrastructure construction, funds, construction methods, materials. Sustainability of infrastructure and maintenance of infrastructure are also key branches here. Now, the thing to note is that each of these 15 success factor categories will have branches like these, and we will provide these in more detail. So a success factor tree is articulated for each one of these 15 categories, and that is provided in a PDF document, and we'll talk about that a little later. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So this is an abstraction of the checklist that we'll be talking about. And so as a researcher or development practitioner, you can assess each factor and think about how it may or may not connect to your work. Even if a given success factor does not directly relate to your research or project in the broader system, it may be critical that it is addressed in order to enable your work to have its optimal impact, and thus consideration of ways that you can influence that factor may be important. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a checklist or this is the process that we go through as part of the checklist. And the checklist we observed in the preceding slide optimizes the process of selecting success factor categories relevant to your work by answering the series of questions. First, we ask if a given success factor category is required for our work to have impact. If the answer is no, we should just move to the next success factor category. If the answer is yes, however, we ask if the factor category is adequately addressed in the existing system. If the answer here is yes, then it's already covered and we can move on to the next category. However, if the answer there is no, then we objectively assess the evidence available to address the factor category. If we believe that we know all that we can and can answer yes to this question, we should move on to the next category. But if the answer is no, then we do not feel that we know enough or what is needed, and we ask, what can we do to contribute evidence via research to inform how to make this category a reality? So that's the process of selecting if your success factor category is important enough to to delve into it deeply, and we'll go through this again in more detail a little bit later. So this is what, next slide please. So clicking through all this, we'll see that once we've answered the series of questions for the previous slide for all the 15 categories, we'll end up with a list of relevant categories that are deemed to be required but may not have enough evidence yet to adequately address a problem under consideration. In addition to the demonstrated gaps identified through the SLA process, research questions should be specific, have strategic value, and leverage your strengths and partnerships, have value for stakeholders, and be feasible to answer. The process we show here should help narrow potential questions, but some additional considerations will help with final selection as well. So again, what we're showing here is an abstracted illustration of what it would look like once you went through the process. This is not the actual template that we'll be using. It's just for illustrative purposes, but we'll go through the template here shortly. Next slide, please. Okay, what preceded was a brief overview of the success factors and how they are used to facilitate a comprehensive examination of a system to identify critical gaps that can be addressed through research. We'll now look at how to apply the system level of analysis process in more detail with a specific example. Next slide. Go back one. Okay. Should you choose to use SLA as part of the MSI RFA, this is the process you will apply. You'll begin by identifying your problem. Then you will use the 15 success factor categories and associated checklist to identify the critical areas of focus. Then you will identify gaps in knowledge that need to be addressed. And identification of required and unaddressed categories can enhance the potential for your work to achieve its desired outcome, and this will be reflected in the research questions generated. Note at the bottom of this slide, there are two banners that will be shown on most of the following slides to indicate either the general principle or the actual activity example that's being worked through as an example. Okay, next slide. All right, suppose that you work on early grade reading in South Sudan, and that is a priority for the country and USAID. It will have many identified problems and potential solution spaces. We need to be selective in our process. It is essential to choose a problem that is specific, clear, and not too large. So in this example that we're going through now, that we have selected early grade reading in South Sudan as the priority. The problem is early grade students in rural areas are testing below the standard required level for their age group. And the specific problem is that schools do not have access to age appropriate reading materials. The target beneficiary population will be rural schools, students, and teachers. And so the activity one as part of the template that will be provided to you will help you go through and identify these three areas. All right, next slide. We're moving on to activity two. identifying missing success factor categories. So this is where the abstract that I showed earlier, we're now going to actually go into the detail here. This is where we're fulfilling the second RFA requirement, the identification of gaps using a system level view. The step aids us in thinking about what needs to come next within the categories that are identified as relevant. Building from activity 1, this activity will help you identify the missing success factor categories that you may want to consider to address with new research questions. The system level view can lead to new understandings. Yeah, we covered that. So again, the 15 categories form the basis for the view of the problem, and the next slides will guide us step by step through the process. Okay, we can go to the next step. Okay, recall this slide from earlier. We'll go through this process step by step in the activity here to identify the categories. And this slide also recall from earlier. This is the detail in the branches of the success factor tree. In this case, the infrastructure category that we'll be delving into to help us go through the categories in more detail. All right. So now we're actually going to go through the template. So for each of the success factor categories in the Activity 2 template, you ask yourself, is this category required for your work to have impact? So for our problem, schools do not have access to age-appropriate reading materials. We understand that infrastructure is indeed required because reading materials need to be delivered to schools, which also requires road infrastructure, methods of delivery, transport, etc. So there are several aspects of infrastructure that are necessary. So of course we will say yes, and then we will ask the next question, which is this category currently adequately being addressed, right? So this exercise here may require some knowledge of your ecosystem and or awareness factors and actions being taken towards your intended goal that you may not currently know immediately. So in this case, you might want to perform a quick web search or literature review to develop an informed perspective. You may need to consult knowledgeable members of your project team as well. So for this example, we will answer no. If the answer happened to be yes, however, then you would go no further in infrastructure and proceed to the equipment and supplies category to ask the very first question again. And so, yeah, so here we're answering no. And so then we have to answer, do we have sufficient evidence to address this category? Again, if the answer is yes, we move to the next equipment and supplies category because we already have enough information. But if the answer is no, then this means that it is a missing success factor that we have to address for the problem to eventually be solved. And so, yeah, so we're going to say no here again and go to the fourth question, the fourth column in this template. And this is where we begin to ask what needs to be learned to help fulfill the requirements of this category. So we can go to the next slide, and it shows that we're starting to fill in this column 4 of the infrastructure category. We have added some ideas here as to what needs to be learned or done in terms of infrastructure to help resolve our example problem, namely rural schools not having access to age-appropriate reading materials. These questions or ideas will serve as the first thoughts on potential research questions. And from here, your team can study more, reach out to experts, and begin to formulate more detailed research questions, which we do in Activity 3. All right, so now we're moving to Activity 3. So again, we would go through that whole template and the whole process for each of the 15 success factor categories and identify those that are missing, and then we delve in deeply for each of those that are missing. So now we move to Activity 3, where we formulate a plan of action by generating research questions to address the knowledge gaps identified in Activity 2. All right, next slide. So here is the Activity 3 worksheet template. It begins, we begin with it by writing your problem at the very top, so we always have that in mind. And then listed in the columns at the top of the worksheet here are the 3 questions that you want to address in more detail for those success factors that you have identified as important to your work, which we did in the previous one. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So based on the descriptions you recorded in the final column of activity 2, you may be able to identify some immediate actions that you can undertake that build on your own expertise and experience to address these gaps. So that's the first column in the activity 3 template, is what action should I take, or what existing sources should I study to learn more about the topic. All right. And so next slide, here is the example with 3 ideas written down for the infrastructure success factor. As we do this, we will be able to refine and expand on our questions from activity 2 for each relevant success factor. And this will allow us to prepare validated research questions. All right, next slide. So this is the second column. Now we want to ask which research questions could be studied to better address the knowledge gaps in the success factor category. Answering these research questions should help solve your identified problem, also support the achievement of the larger project outcomes. Note that these research questions may not be directly linked to your area or expertise or experience. Instead, they may require the input of other fields or other stakeholders in the system. But if pursued, the results of related research questions should support the development of the missing success factors and the research questions that you have identified that you are going to tackle. So the next slide here, next slide, please, is the example. So let's say we've done some of the literature review, stakeholder interviews, and other outreach necessary, and are able to validate some of the gaps and opportunities. We can then refine our areas for learning to generate some new research questions that address the newly identified opportunities. We have generated new research questions written in here for the infrastructure category that identify gaps in the system, and we have templates and frameworks of systems and thoughts and evidence for our process. Now, the only missing part here, the third column, is potential partners, which is the next step in the process. But since it is fairly self-evident, you know, to identify potential partners, then we're going to skip this as part of this presentation due to time constraints. And so that concludes our SLA overview for this webinar. I'd just like to note that the success factor trees and the template that you'll use if you choose to select this method are on the MSI RFA webpage on the Laser Pulse website. At the very big bottom, we have a link to the previous webinar that we've gone over this process, that you can review that in more detail at your own leisure. And underneath that video are links to the success factor tree PDF, as well as the downloadable Word document that has the activity template that you'll use.